In this lesson, we'll be learning about analyzing vulnerabilities. Analyzing vulnerabilities is a critical step that we must perform to help strengthen our cybersecurity defenses. As we move through this lesson, we're going to explore the various concepts related to analyzing vulnerabilities, including confirming the vulnerabilities exist, prioritizing the vulnerabilities, classifying the vulnerabilities, the organizational impact of those vulnerabilities, the exposure factor of the vulnerabilities, and how all of this compares to the risk tolerance in your organization. Now, first, let's start out with vulnerability confirmation. When you run a vulnerability scan of your network, numerous vulnerabilities are going to be detected. Now, some of these vulnerabilities are going to be real, and some of these are really not an issue for us. So a part of our vulnerability management process is that we have to analyze each alert or finding to determine if it's a true positive, true negative, or false negative. Now, a true positive occurs when there is a real and exploitable vulnerability that has been correctly identified by your vulnerability scanner. Basically, our systems say that we're vulnerable, and we analyze the finding, and we agree the vulnerability does exist inside of our system. For example, if we perform a vulnerability scan on a system and it detects we're missing a critical security patch like Microsoft 17-010, and we look at that system and we agree that patch was never installed, this is known as a true positive because that system is indeed vulnerable to attacks against this known vulnerability because the patch to mitigate that has not been installed. Now, a false positive is going to occur when the system incorrectly states that a vulnerability exists on the system, but that vulnerability actually doesn't exist. For example, I've had cases where I've scanned a Linux system and the vulnerability scanning report comes back stating that the system is missing a critical Windows security patch and is therefore vulnerable. But because I'm using a Linux machine or server, it's actually not vulnerable to any Windows-based exploit. So this would be considered a false positive because Windows patches are not going to be required on a Linux-based system. Now, a true negative, on the other hand, is going to occur when the system correctly identifies that there is no vulnerability present on the system. For example, if I scan my laptop and it states I have correctly installed all the security patches and updates for my system, it is reporting a true negative because it's stating that my system is secure from known vulnerabilities inside of the scanning engine's database, and that is actually the true state because I am not vulnerable. Now, a false negative is actually one of the most serious findings you can have. With a false negative, the vulnerability scanner does not detect a known vulnerability on the system, even though that vulnerability does actually exist on the system. Now, the reason I consider this to be the most dangerous is because you think you are well protected and secure because your scans are not detecting a known vulnerability, but those vulnerabilities are still there on your system. This often occurs because you forgot to update the scanner's rules or definitions, so the scanner is unaware of a newer exploit that's available that is now attacking a known vulnerability. Second, we need to prioritize our vulnerabilities. Now, when we're prioritizing our vulnerabilities, we need to rank our identified vulnerabilities in the order of their severity and potential impact on the organization to ensure that we can allocate resources that address the most critical security threats first. Several factors are going to come into play during this process, including the ease of exploitation, the magnitude of potential damage, and the importance of the affected system to the organization's operations. For example, if a vulnerability is found in a mission-critical application that could lead to significant data breaches if it was exploited, this is probably going to be prioritized a lot higher than a minor flaw in a less significant system. Now, to assist in this process, security professionals often employ a scoring system like the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS. Now, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System is going to provide us with a standardized framework for assessing the severity of a vulnerability and then assign a score based on metrics such as the attack vector being used, the impact, and the exploitability of that vulnerability. By utilizing a CVSS score and considering our organizational context, our security teams can systematically prioritize our vulnerabilities to ensure that our efforts are being focused where they're needed most and that the risk is being effectively managed. Third, we need to classify our vulnerabilities. Now, classification involves categorizing the identified vulnerabilities based on factors like the type of threat, the potential impact on the organization, and the systems or data that may be affected. By doing so, organizations can better understand the nature of the vulnerabilities and align their remediation efforts accordingly. For example, vulnerabilities might be classified into categories like software flaws, configuration errors, or security policy gaps. Within each of these categories, we can further subclassify these things like buffer overflows, privilege escalation, or insecure default settings. Another way for us to gain information about our vulnerabilities that we can use to aid in the classification of our vulnerabilities is something known as a CVE, or a Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. Now, the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposure System is going to contain a large database of every known vulnerability in the world. Each vulnerability will be assigned a specific CVE number, and this can be used to look up the relevant information about that vulnerability at the website cve.mitre.org or cve.mitre.org. Now, this CVE database serves as a valuable reference for cybersecurity professionals to provide us with a detailed description, potential impact, and references to solutions or workarounds for each vulnerability that's been identified. By cross-referencing your detected vulnerabilities with the CVE database, organizations can gain deeper insights into the nature and characteristics of the threats that they're facing so they can make more informed decisions during the vulnerability management process. Also, by using the CVEs to help classify your vulnerabilities, you're going to be able to systematically evaluate your security posture in order to make informed decisions about prioritizing and addressing your vulnerabilities. By having a clear classification system, security teams can streamline their workflows and ensure they're dealing with these vulnerabilities in a strategic and organized manner. Fourth, we have the organizational impact of the vulnerabilities. Now, it's important to understand the potential impact on your organization in order to properly prioritize your remediation efforts. The vulnerability's impact can be assessed in terms of its confidentiality, integrity, or availability of your different data and services that are going to be affected. A vulnerability that could lead to the exposure of sensitive customer data, for example, would have a significant impact on your organization's reputation and could even result in regulatory fines being imposed upon your company. Similarly, a vulnerability that affects the availability of a critical service would have serious consequences for your business continuity plans, so you may give that a higher prioritization level based on this increased impact to your overall business. The vulnerability's impact on your organization can also be assessed based on the industry that the organization is operating within. For example, vulnerabilities in a healthcare organization could risk patient data and safety, while vulnerabilities at a financial institution could lead to monetary losses and increased scrutiny by regulators, and in both of these cases, you would prioritize those vulnerabilities higher up than you might for something at a small local store. Now, by considering the specifics around your organization and your industry, your cybersecurity team can better understand how a vulnerability might affect your day-to-day operations, your legal compliance, and overall level of customer trust. Fifth, we have exposure factor of the vulnerability to consider. Now, the exposure factor, or EF, is used as a quantifiable metric to help a cybersecurity professional understand the exact percentage of an asset that is likely to be damaged or affected if a particular vulnerability is going to be exploited. At its core, the exposure factor is an estimation of the amount of loss that a vulnerability might cause to your organization. For example, if a critical database contains sensitive customer data and it was compromised, the exposure factor would be considered pretty high, as a large portion or potentially the entire database and that asset could be put at risk. On the other hand, if the vulnerability only exposes non-critical information, the exposure factor there would actually be assigned much lower because it's affecting a much less significant portion of our business or that asset. Now, organizations need to understand the exposure factor because it's used heavily when you're conducting a qualitative risk management inside your organization. By evaluating the exposure factor along with other variables like the threat likelihood and the asset value, your organization will truly be able to understand the potential impact of a successful exploit in mathematical terms so they can properly allocate time, money, and other resources to mitigating the vulnerabilities which pose the greatest risk to your operations and your objectives. And sixth, we need to understand our organization's risk tolerance as we analyze vulnerabilities. Risk tolerance refers to the level of risk that an organization is willing to accept in the pursuit of its objectives before action is deemed necessary to mitigate that risk. By understanding our organization's risk tolerance, we can ensure that we align our organization's approach to vulnerability management with its broader risk management strategy. After all, some organizations might be more risk-averse and will prioritize more stringent security measures that require dedicating a lot more resources to address even the most minor of vulnerabilities, while other organizations may have a higher risk tolerance, so they're going to be more willing to accept a certain level of exposure while they're focusing on more pressing aspects of their business. Basically, if your organization has a low risk tolerance, even vulnerabilities with a minor or moderate impact will need to be remediated more quickly. Conversely, if you work for an organization with a higher risk tolerance, your organization might decide to simply monitor certain vulnerabilities while they're focusing their remediation efforts and money to secure more severe vulnerabilities or those with a higher likelihood of being exploited by a threat actor. In either case, aligning your vulnerability management practices with the organization's risk tolerance is going to ensure that your security efforts are going to remain consistent with your overall business strategies and objectives. So remember, analyzing vulnerabilities is a critical step that we have to perform to strengthen our cybersecurity defenses. Confirming vulnerabilities involves determining the accuracy of an identified potential security weakness by verifying whether it's a true positive, true negative, or false negative. Prioritizing vulnerabilities entails assessing and ranking security vulnerabilities based on several factors, including their severity, potential impact, and likelihood of exploitation, so your organization can properly allocate resources to remediate your vulnerabilities more effectively. Classifying vulnerabilities means that we're going to categorize identified security weaknesses into different groups based on their characteristics like the type of threat, the affected system, and the potential impact to streamline our management and response efforts. The exposure factor is going to refer to the percentage of loss that an organization will experience if a specific vulnerability was exploited on a given resource. And your organization's risk tolerance is going to refer to the level of risk that an organization is willing to accept or mitigate in pursuit of its objectives and operations. By systematically analyzing, confirming, classifying, and prioritizing vulnerabilities, understanding the exposure factor, and aligning these processes with the organization's risk tolerance, we're going to be better able to equip ourselves to build a more secure, resilient, and responsive cybersecurity infrastructure.